Long after the death of Freud, the couch remains the key symbol of psychoanalysis, an invitation to reveal everything.
The Black Lives Matter movement taking place under a Black president, Black attorney general, and Black Homeland Security cabinet secretary. That's when it started, under that official Black power with a neoliberal order that cannot deliver protection for poor and working class Black folk. I'm not talking about the Black bourgeoisie now. I'm talking about the Black poor and working folk. Or a president who can assassinate American citizens with no due process. And the New York Times, the Washington Post, none of the pundits, none of the critics, none of the liberal writers can say a mumbling word for the most part.
An authentic leftist, what was totally absent in him was what I called with some so-called politically correct people, this opportunist side of political correctness, you know, without seeing the deeper roots and so on. Quite often, political correctness can work in a way which reinforces certain prejudices and so on and so on. I have many brothers, Black friends, who are very sensitive to this. They very intelligently perceive patronizing, condescending attitude in obeying politically correct rules and so on and so on. And he was an authentic anti-racist.
Frequently says that racism is a problem for white people to solve. It's not a problem for other groups to solve. And certainly what we know about psychology research of prejudice shows that prejudice is pretty widespread. There is prejudice basically in every community. Now, of course, she would retort by redefining the concept of racism by saying, no, racism is power plus prejudice. But even that conception is very, very thin in that power is very contextual. For instance, if you live in like a majority Black city where like the mayor, the police chief, all the city council members are Black, like I'm thinking about where I grew up, Atlanta, like outside Atlanta, it's very, very difficult to say, oh, you know, it's still the whites are behind everything. Like, no, they aren't. Like, Black people can make choices. They are political and moral and social agents, right?
It's not as though there's only one variety of this, but I would say that the sort of essentialist thinking is a fundamental component of the anti-racist project. That thinking about people, even if you're going to allow them some degree of individual autonomy, at the end of the day, they're always Black people. They're always white people. And as a result, there are certain characteristics that they simply cannot avoid and can't escape, and certain things about themselves that perhaps they cannot undo. And in that very way, that is what I find most disconcerting about the present moment and about the prevalence of these ideas. And I think ultimately it's the thing that makes it the most dangerous as well. There is something inherently valuable about us being able to relate to one another as individuals, and about us being able to understand that when we talk about things like privilege and power, that the circumstance and the context matters, and that it is, I'm going around Brooklyn, having recently returned here while, you know, still on lockdown in some respects, I'm struck by the Black Lives Matter posters that I see all over the place, by the people who've scrawled it on the masks that they're wearing on their faces in Sharpie and on their T-shirts because they apparently can't get enough paraphernalia. I said there's something that, you know, struck me yesterday. I appreciate that everyone wants to do good, that they want to be seen as a part of a solution to a problem. I bristle at the lack of thoughtfulness that's going into this project, though. And I am someone who has not ever felt in his adult life particularly conscious about his appearance in that respect. You know, I'm sufficiently handsome that I don't have to think about it. But I find myself walking around Brooklyn now, and it's palpable. Like this sense that people are aware of my appearance and are perhaps making all sorts of assumptions about the privilege they enjoy and that I don't. And it's a bit infuriating because it couldn't be further from the truth. You know,
think about all the shit you could get away with.
It's just crazy.
Most often talking about rethinking freedom, equality, and justice, making it stronger, making it more encompassing, making it more substantial, less abstract and less exclusionary. So that doesn't strike me as as a particularism, like, oh, here are all these identities, they're struggling for their particular interests, they're taking away from the common good, they're taking away from a universal framework, they're taking away from a larger sense of politics. No, I think it is the larger sense of politics that's being identified as exclusionary, and there's a call for a re-articulation of those basic principles. So they are justice projects, freedom projects, and equality projects. And when we dismiss them as identity projects, we're clinging to an older ideal and not looking at the exclusions it has made, the effacements on which it has proceeded. And we're holding to a status quo that actually does need to be radically challenged. Now, I have one other point as part of my introductory remarks, and that's the following. The largest, most influential and dangerous version of identity politics that we are living with in this world is white supremacy. That is an identity politics. That is the defense of whiteness. That is the defense of whiteness as superior, the defense of whiteness as the norm, as that which doesn't even need to be marked as part of the norm. And the neo-fascist trends we are seeing, the hyper-nationalism we're seeing, the border violence, the border closing, the border violence that we're seeing throughout Europe, these are racist projects of states that are very often promising to their people a restoration of white supremacy, a defense of white supremacy against racial and ethnic and religious diversity. And so I think that we often imagine that identity politics is a fragmenting process that the left is responsible for, or that has happened inside the left. But actually, the largest and most noxious, most destructive one is white identity politics, which takes the form of asserting white supremacy either explicitly or implicitly. And we need to get wiser about how that's happening and how we might oppose it.
No, so I just think she's presented such a thin view of the world, and I think one of you had brought this up, that there is a chance that a lot of this will backfire and actually make even white people more prejudiced. There's actually a lot of research on diversity trainings, on kind of anti-bias and anti-prejudice training, and I'm thinking about one paper in particular. It's called "Ironic Effects of Anti-Prejudice Messages." It's by Lisa Legault and her team. She's at Clarkson University, and what she did is she gave out brochures and she gave out questionnaires to different groups of participants. One group of brochures and questionnaires, like they had messaging that was designed around telling you about how diversity is positive, how there are benefits for you, how you like being around people with other cultures. And she found that those were pretty effective. But then another one was kind of the D'Angelo type stuff, which was talking about how racism is your problem, how it's a shame, how you should feel guilty. And actually, when she gave those to people, it was actually worse. They actually became more prejudiced than people who hadn't gotten any kind of treatment or experiment. It actually backfired to give people this messaging that they're like inherently guilty, that there's something wrong with them, that they should feel ashamed, that they need to repent. Like this type of messaging generally does backfire. And I have a feeling that a lot of people who are reading this book, they might be doing it for social, propriety. They might be trying to portray a certain image by owning it, by not speaking up. But what we're really talking about is people's hearts and minds. And in their heart and their mind, they may actually be becoming more prejudiced because they feel like they're being targeted or singled out because a very complex problem has been made very narrow.
Right.
I'm wondering if you guys are seeing that.
Where effectively people who are high income are still voting a lot of times for right-leaning parties, but people who are high education are now oftentimes voting for left-leaning parties. We can throw the latest paper that you all just published up there on the screen. The title here is Brahmin Left versus Merchant Right, Changing Political Cleavages in 21 Western Democracies Between 1948 and 2020. The dynamic that you point to is basically, both sides of the political spectrum being controlled by different sets of elites and people with lower educational levels concentrating more and more on the right side of the political spectrum. Just dig into some of the data and what you found.
In the 1950s and 60s, social democratic and affiliated parties, so including the Democratic Party in the US, used to be supported very strongly by low-income and lower-educated voters, while conservative parties used to gather more support from high-income and higher-educated voters. And in the past 50, 60 years, well, income does continue to determine higher support for right-wing parties in general. Meanwhile, the effect of education has completely reversed. The educational divide has followed a striking reversal. And today, higher educated voters are much more likely to vote for the left. And so this leads to a separation between what we propose to call a Brahmin left, a sort of intellectual elite educated left, and a sort of still high-income merchant right.
But I'm just not sure identity politics is the term that can describe those struggles. Yeah. And I also think that it's a way of not listening. It's like, call it identity politics, and then you don't have to listen because you've got your category already. You put it in that category. You don't have to listen to what folks are saying. Yeah. So that worries me.
It's sad, but unfortunately, a lot of times our demands aren't really met unless we have really serious asks or we generate these larger conversations. Unfortunately, people usually don't listen to us when we're being reasonable. So I think it's really to make a statement that this sort of thing happens weekly, that Asian Americans are always a punchline. And so I think we're just trying to make a point that people will be held accountable the next time they do these sort of things. I was going to say that I feel like it's incredibly patronizing for you to paint these questions this way, especially as a white man. I don't expect you to be able to understand what people of color are actually saying.
Oh, this import from America, gender, that's what's destroying us. That's destroying our lives. It's like, but how do we think about that intersection? And I think we need a more textured analysis. I don't think we can go back to this is the real oppression and all this is secondary. Absolutely. It's like, no, we've got to have like Gramsci in mind here. What's the articulation? Absolutely. How do we describe it?
And the left has failed because we on the left have been unable to put forward a vision that seizes the imagination and hearts, minds, and souls of people.
I agree.
Unable to have institutional capacity for that vision. Yeah.
Well, you do it. You're the one we look to, Cornell. You do it.
You don't owe anybody anything.
If I got paid for all of my emotional labor, I'd have like a lot of money.
Man, shit is bad right now. It is bad, and it is getting worse. And one thing I'm also concerned about in terms of backlash, like I'm deeply concerned about that this could be a moment for actual white supremacists, for actual white nationalists, which I don't want to overstate the threat of white nationalists. I don't think that we like, there clearly white nationalism exists, but I do not think they are in any danger of gaining cultural power at this moment. That said, I don't think that it's a good idea to make a bunch of white people feel resentful because of the way they were born. I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think it's a good idea. It's a fucking recruiting tool right there. And I also don't think it's a good idea to make black people reevaluate or evaluate every interaction that they have through the lens of race. Wow. If like at one point, D'Angelo apologized to her co-facilitator who was a black woman because she interrupted her. And this was an act of white supremacy. And this idea that every time there's any sort of slight or any slight between like a white person does anything to a black person or any person of color, that means it's necessarily racist. I think that's really dangerous because I don't want to live in a world where all black people think that if I if I cut them off in traffic, that's a racial aggression.
Well, I think, and speaking to what Kamal's point was earlier, that perhaps he does have non-white people in his social circle who are starting to talk like this.
Yeah.
If you come at this from my point of view, which is that like race is a social fiction, it really doesn't define anything about anybody. But something that does actually impact people's social networks, right? Like if you're in a particular social network and you have to do certain things to get ahead, you're going to start doing them. And I think that if this has become a huge professional class thing, if Fortune 500 companies are promoting this book, if they're offering trainings, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation hired D'Angelo to do things, Unilever hired D'Angelo to do things, I think there's plenty of incentives if you're a non-white person to start saying, well, your colleagues are racist, this is a white supremacist structure that I'm in, et cetera, because it'll lead to deference to you. Like you'll actually get powers and privileges in your workplace if you start going along with it. Even if at first you think it's wrong, as Upton Sinclair said, anything that a man's paycheck relies on, it's much easier to get them to believe it. And I think that if you lay out those kind of perverse incentives, both white people and non-white people will go along, and it has nothing to do with the fact that their skin is white or not white. It's just the social network that they're in, and that if that becomes the way to promote yourself within that network, I think tons of people will get involved in it for that reason. I can think of numerous friends. I'm not going to name names here. People I worked with in kind of the NGO, journalism, industrial complex, who had very moderate politics when I worked with them. We thought I was like a crazy quasi-communist radical or whatever, right? And I see their writing now around these topics, and so much of it just comes across as like they're going with a crowd who is making this the way to advance your career. Like you will go to the top of the charts if you just nod your head and say, yeah, D'Angelo is correct about everything. Ibram Kendi is correct about everything. It has kind of become somehow very quickly, without a whole lot of public consent, because I think most Americans don't really think this way at this point, it's somehow become the establishment, the cultural establishment, very, very quickly, in ways that I can't really remember any other cultural shifts that happened this quickly at this level.
Yeah, there's nothing that I can think of, nothing in my lifetime, certainly nothing from a historical standpoint that I can think of that rivals it. There's one thought that I'd like to share. It's my favorite passage from James Baldwin, and it's perhaps the one that I think is the least well known, perhaps, maybe most overlooked, and also most essential passage from The Fire Next Time. And it's when he describes the gates of paranoia. And he talks about how Black people being in this unique position of having always had historically, white people be this evil, malevolent force in their lives, risk having the gates of paranoia close on them, which is to say, as you were describing, Katie, in every single interaction, they could find ways to imagine that what's happening here is some sort of malevolent racist plot, and that they can find that it happens in every imaginable circumstance, and they no longer find themselves even attempting to differentiate between something that is real and something that is imagined, and that they find themselves doing that and don't even realize that this process has taken hold. And it has long been my contention and concern that to the extent Blackness is a thing from a cultural standpoint, one of, in my experience, the most consistent features of Black identity is a sense that there is this specter of oppression in society, that there is, in fact, already a baseline of sort of racial paranoia that exists there. And it manifests itself in a lot of different ways: the prevalence of conspiracy theories, the general suspicion of white people in various professional settings, as some studies have pointed to, specifically in the context of healthcare in some instances. That is a dangerous circumstance, and one that I do worry about getting worse. And it's really amongst the principal reasons why I found myself personally rejecting any sort of racial identification at all, because it wasn't something that I wanted to be a part of. And it was certainly something that is taught and is pretty universal. And I, as late as, being in college, had found myself thinking about the world in that way. And it's a massive cognitive load to try to labor under in a professional setting, to be at work and to feel as though you're constantly under threat on account of your Blackness, to be trying to be successful in academia and to worry about that. It is a burden that will necessarily have a deleterious impact on your ability to be successful. And there are a lot of reasons to respond to it by sort of reinforcing that dynamic. If everyone else around you similarly has these contentions, to sort of buy into, a theory that race is what explains some circumstance without thinking about it, it's incredibly dangerous.
And then you don't have to listen because you've got your category already. You put it in that category. You don't have to listen to what folks are saying. Or you don't have to listen to what folks are saying. Or you don't have to listen to what folks are saying.
Then movements adopt identity politics and intersectional ideologies, contra-intersectional ideologies, in ways that render them subversive. They become, in effect, insurgencies. In very extreme cases, they deteriorate into domestic terrorism. But even in the more benign cases, these homegrown grassroots movements, they tend to become very, very aggressive, exclusionary, identity-oriented, hermetic, schizoid, closed-in, defiant, contumacious. There's an attack on authority. And if you're thinking, well, this list sounds like a psychopath, you're right. This is the list of traits of a psychopath. These identity politics groups, these victimhood-centered groups, tend to become psychopathic as an integral dynamic, not related on particular individuals as members of the group or particular individuals as leaders. The dynamic of a group is psychopathic. They develop collective psychopathy. Very often, victimhood groups also tend to compensate for their sense of innate inferiority and for the humiliation of having been a victim. They tend to compensate with grandiosity. So in the narcissistic abuse movement today, we have empaths. Empaths are angels. They can do nothing wrong. They are wonderful people. They are amazing. They're perfect. They are, in other words, narcissists. So grandiosity and psychopathy tend to evolve naturally as an emergent phenomenon in victimhood-centered social justice movements long before they are hijacked by narcissists and psychopaths. Actually, narcissists and psychopaths gravitate to these movements owing to their increasing narcissistic and psychopathic profile. And so then we have the tendency for victimhood, which is this new construct. We have these studies that show, psychopaths and narcissists as active members, not only leaders. And the whole thing deteriorates into demonizing, mudslinging, partisanship, aggression in extreme cases, recently not so extreme and not so rare, even violence. Now, there's a big difference between left-leaning victimhood movements, right-leaning victimhood movements, and neutral movements. An example of a neutral movement would be the narcissistic abuse movement, because it incorporates people with leftist views, people with rightist views, and so on. It's centered around the injustice done to victims of narcissistic abuse by narcissists and psychopaths. It is undergoing the very same process. It had become more and more grandiose, and it had been taken over by psychopathic and narcissistic con artists and scammers, all these online coaches and experts and so on. But still, it is neutral in the political sense. Left-leaning victimhood-centered movements tend to focus on entitlement and grandiosity. They compensate with grandiosity, entitlement, and they are fantastic in nature. For example, they seek to rewrite history counterfactually. So women are doing this in the feminist movement. They are rewriting the history of the world as though it had been centered around women, when actually women had always been, since the agricultural revolution, marginal in world affairs. Blacks have African American studies departments where they rewrite history to render blacks the builders of the nation and the greatest contributors to science and literature, which is utter, sheer, unmitigated counterfactual nonsense. So there is grandiose compensation and a deep sense of entitlement. These are two main features of narcissism because they lead to a lack of empathy. And if you talk to blacks in any setting with any conviction, members of these movements or not, they have become much less empathic. They sound very narcissistic, I must say. And I'm sure I'll get a million comments about this this element. So this is the left-leaning movements, entitlement, grandiosity. The right-leaning movements combine two other psychological traits. Conspiracism, which is the tendency to believe in conspiracy theories as organizing and explanatory principles. Conspiracism, coupled with grandiosity, for example, in white supremacy, coupled with schizoid tendencies, the wish to be left alone, small government, no taxation, no adventures in foreign lands, America first. So the right-leaning movements, they tend to be more conspiracy-minded. They tend to be more monkish. They have centered around withdrawal, around avoidance, much less around entitlement. They're afraid of entitlement, actually, because they translate entitlement to bigger government, more intrusive government, nanny state, big brother, 1984 Orwellian things. So their conspiracism actually prevents right-wing movements from becoming fully narcissistic, because they deny the element of entitlement. But they have a pronounced lack of empathy, much bigger than in the left victimhood-centered movements, and they are much more psychopathic, in the sense that they are much less averse to using aggression. They are much more defiant. They are much more contumacious. They detest authority, clean the swamp, drain the swamp in Washington. So they are more psychopathic. To summarize, the left is narcissistic, entitled, and grandiose. It's centered around victimhood and translates victimhood into claims on society. They claim rights, they claim money, reparations for slavery, or reparations for the Holocaust. They claim, so it's more entitlement oriented. And what can I get out of it? And the right-wing groups, entitlement groups, they are not exactly victimhood groups. They are victims of conspiracies, but not victims of society or systemic, because they are mostly white. Right-wing groups are mostly white. They belong to the majority. They are less likely to present themselves as victims. They may be victims of impersonal forces, such as globalization, or the collapse of manufacturing in the United States, or automation, or whatever. But they are more focused on withdrawal, avoidance, and using power where necessary to protect rights, for example, gun rights. In the middle, we have the neutral movements, the justice movements. They are not social justice movements. They are individual justice movements, like the narcissistic abuse movement. And these movements in the middle, they have the worst of both worlds, actually. They have entitlement, they have grandiosity, but they also have defiance, contumaciousness, and conspiracy-oriented paranoia. This is the picture. When narcissists and psychopaths observe these groups, what they see is a gold mine. It's a new pathological narcissistic space. They can thrive in these settings. They can become leaders. They can become media figures. They can obtain narcissistic supply. They can make money. They can have sex with followers and fans. It's fun. It's great. It's a playground. It's a haunt. It's a pub. And so narcissists and psychopaths flock into these movements, and because of their particular personality structure. Narcissists know how to be charming. Narcissists verbalize much better than the average population. Many narcissists and psychopaths are highly intelligent, and all of them are goal-oriented. They are reckless, they're callous, they are disempathic, they're relentless, so they rise to the top. They become the leaders of these movements. And this is how all these movements end.
If you're going to do research in indigenous communities, you're going to have to build that relationship ahead of time, and it can take a long time. Even in my own community, where I am from, it took us 2 years to get our community survey off the ground, because we needed to build those relationships. We needed to repair some of the damage that research had done. My own adopted sister, refused
to get involved with the research, even though our board had approved, or that the local had approved the research.
Well, but how do we think about that intersection? And I think we need a more textured analysis. I don't think we can go back to this is the real oppression and all this is secondary. Absolutely. It's like, no, we've got to have like Gramsci in mind here.
Siding with both this later Lukács and the Althusser, who is harshly critical of Gramsci in what is to be done, that I would argue that essentially, what has happened in terms of the trajectory of Western Marxism is that starting with the young Lukács, the Lukács of specifically history and class consciousness, as well as the Gramsci of the prison notebooks and also the Korsch of Marxism and philosophy, there's actually this interesting set of tensions in the very origins of this of the trajectory of 20th century European Marxism, including what's then led up to certain things that are part of our current situation, that can be seen in terms of issues having to do with concerns over economism, and with it, hand-wringing about various kinds of reductionism. And if you look at within the young Lukács himself, you can see a tension in history and class consciousness, between, on the one hand, what Lukács shares with the other founding figures of Western Marxism, especially Korsch and Gramsci, the rejection of any kind of crudely reductive economism, again, whether of Second International or Stalinist varieties. But of course, not Stalin quite yet, since it's 1923. But at the same time, of course, the most famous chapter of history and class consciousness is the one on reification. And of course, what is the lesson of reification a la Lukács, whatever later self-critical caveats he attaches to it after 1923? Well, it's that, what starts at the level of the economy in terms of the commodity form doesn't stay there, that it basically spreads out and colonizes. It, in a sense, reduces all of the rest of social reality under capitalism, to this form of alienating, thingification, Verdinglichung, and that we get, and that with reification, we get the emphasis on the fact that indeed capitalism is objectively reductionistic in terms of how it operates. And so that would seem to call for, instead of worrying about a historical materialism as a theory, first and foremost, of capitalist society and its history, that it would seem as though being worried about having an anti-reductive historical materialism, while at the same time acknowledging that capitalism itself is really objectively in and of itself reductionistic and economically reductionistic, that indicates that there's a bit of a problematic tension there. And that, here I can't help but think of, so in 2004, on The Daily Show, this is a now very dated reference, but back when George W. Bush's Iraq War started to take a turn for the significantly worse in terms of Bush's plans and purposes, the correspondent Rob Corddry, in dialogue with Jon Stewart as the then host of this program, was playing a reporter who was covering the Iraq War, and who at one point says to Stewart, you see, John, what we're currently struggling with in reporting on the war here is that the facts themselves are biased, that the facts of the war are showing an alarming anti-Bush bias, right? And I would say that in a certain way too, like apropos capitalism, it's that, well, it's not that, a reductionistic theory is necessarily wrong when what you're dealing with is a reality that in and of itself is actually reductionistic, is that, capitalism itself has this very reductionistic agenda. And, a theory that insists on being anti-reductive and rejects economism entirely is likely to be in certain very problematic ways out of step with its target object of inquiry. And to me, one of the real ironies is, starting with the young Lukács and coloring a lot of Western Marxism, is that they end up being anti-reductive where they should be reductive, namely in terms of a historical materialist theorization of an object, namely capitalist society, that is itself inherently reductionistic in its very reality. I mean, here I'd almost call for a notion of real reduction to complement the Sohn-Rethel notion of real abstraction. And then it is reductive where it should be anti-reductive, namely in, starting with the young Lukács, the repudiation of anything along the lines of Engels's dialectics of nature, and with that essentially ceding all of non-human nature to the explanatory jurisdiction of non-dialectical scientific approaches.